In 2022, a United States Navy P-8A Poseidon reconnaissance aircraft flew a routine mission over the South China Sea. But mid-flight, it received a stern radio transmission, a warning from Chinese border patrols. "You have entered Chinese airspace," the voice said. "Leave immediately." The same message would be broadcast days later to a second aircraft traveling through the region. This time, journalists were on board, and the recording was clear. China has sovereignty over the Spratly Islands as well as the surrounding maritime areas. Stay away immediately to avoid misjudgment. At first glance, this might seem like a typical territorial warning, one nation asserting control over what it considers its airspace. But here's the twist. Under international law, the area the U.S. aircraft flew over doesn't actually belong to China. In response to the warning, the American pilot coolly replied over the radio, "I am a sovereign immune United States naval aircraft conducting lawful military activities beyond the national airspace of any coastal state." He didn't even mention that some of the islands below didn't exist a decade ago. So what's really going on here? Can a country simply create land in the middle of the ocean and then claim it as sovereign territory? The answer is far from straightforward. To build artificial islands, countries often deploy large dredging ships that pour sand, gravel, and even concrete into shallow waters, layer after layer, until a new landmass rises above sea level. Eventually, that artificial island can be topped with structures, runways, ports, and even military installations. But when it comes to international law, specifically the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, UNCLOS, things aren't that simple. UNCLOS allows coastal nations to claim up to 12 nautical miles of territorial sea, roughly 22 kilometers, from their natural shoreline. This area is considered an extension of the nation's land, where it exercises full sovereignty. Foreign ships, however, are still allowed to pass peacefully. Beyond that is the Exclusive Economic Zone, or EEZ, extending up to 200 nautical miles, about 230 standard miles, from the coast. Within this zone, the country has exclusive rights to natural resources like fish, oil, and gas, but does not have full territorial control. Here's where it gets tricky. Under UNCLOS, artificial islands do not generate territorial waters or new EEZs. In other words, just because you build an island doesn't mean you can extend your country's borders with it. Yet, this is exactly what China has been trying to do. Over the last decade, China has undertaken one of the largest land reclamation projects in history, primarily in the Spratly Islands and Paracel Islands. Since 2013, China has constructed at least 7 artificial islands in the Spratlys and developed 20 outposts in the Paracels. It even seized control of the Scarborough Shoal from the Philippines in 2012. Altogether, China has created more than 3,200 acres of new land in the South China Sea. Other nations in the region, particularly the Philippines, Vietnam, Malaysia, Brunei, and Taiwan, are not pleased. These countries also lay claim to various parts of the South China Sea, making it one of the most hotly disputed regions on the planet. If you look at a map of territorial waters and EEZs in the region, it's immediately obvious that many of these zones overlap. The overlapping claims are complex enough, but China adds a unique twist. Beijing doesn't just claim individual islands or reefs, it claims nearly the entire South China Sea. This claim is represented by a dashed line or a 9-dash line, recently updated to 10 dashes in a 2023 version of China's national map. That map was published by China's Ministry of Natural Resources and shows 10 dashed lines enclosing about 90% of the South China Sea, including the Spratly Islands, Paracel Islands, Scarborough Shoal, and even Taiwan. From China's perspective, these are historic waters. Beijing argues that ancient Chinese dynasties, going back to the Han Dynasty in the 2nd century AD, explored and administered these seas. Ancient texts, maps, and navigational records are cited as proof that the region has always been Chinese territory. That's China's justification. But the rest of the world disagrees, especially because the world has changed dramatically since those ancient times. Empires have risen and fallen. Borders have shifted. International treaties have been signed and revised. Most recently, a 2016 ruling by an international tribunal in The Hague explicitly rejected China's maritime claims, stating they had no legal basis under international law. China ignored the ruling. So why is China so determined to control this vast expanse of ocean? The answer boils down to 3 key factors: natural resources, strategic trade routes, and military advantage. Let's start with resources. By the late 1970s, countries in Southeast Asia began to discover significant oil and gas reserves under the South China Sea. Today, It's believed that the seabed may contain up to 11 billion barrels of untapped oil and massive reserves of natural gas. That alone would be reason enough for any country to assert claims over the region. But that's not all. The South China Sea is also one of the most biodiverse marine regions on Earth. It supports more than 3,000 species of fish and some of the richest coral reef systems in the world. For millions of people in Southeast Asia, the sea is a primary source of protein. China's fishing industry is massive, with over 450,000 fishing vessels and an estimated 7 to 9 million fishermen. It operates the largest fishing fleet in the world. Revenues from fishing contribute nearly 3% of China's GDP, totaling up to $279 billion annually. For a country of over a billion people, maintaining access to rich fishing grounds is a national priority. Still, it's not just about fish or fossil fuels. The South China Sea is also a geopolitical choke point. Roughly one-third of all global shipping traffic, valued at more than $5 trillion annually, passes through these waters. The sea connects the Pacific and Indian Oceans via the Strait of Malacca, one of the busiest shipping lanes in the world. For China, this is a lifeline. About 40% of its total trade, as well as a third of India's and 20% of Japan's, flows through the South China Sea. Control over this maritime highway gives Beijing enormous economic and strategic leverage. If war ever broke out and China lost access to these waters, it would cripple the nation's economy. So by militarizing the region, Beijing is essentially buying insurance, making sure it can protect vital trade routes, even in times of crisis. And that brings us to the final point, military strategy. China has turned several of its artificial islands into heavily fortified military outposts. These include Woody Island, Fiery Cross Reef, Mischief Reef, and Subi Reef, each now equipped with runways, radar systems, missile launchers, and hangars for patrol and combat aircraft. Some of the runways are 2 miles long, capable of handling large military planes. China has also deployed HQ-9 surface-to-air missile systems, YJ-12B anti-ship missiles, and early warning radar systems on these islands. From these positions, China can project military power across much of Southeast Asia. The logic is clear. Whoever controls these islands controls the sky and sea around them. However, these moves have raised serious concerns among neighboring countries and among global powers like the United States. According to U.S. military commanders, China has fully militarized the South China Sea, turning it into a potential flashpoint for international conflict. Despite repeated warnings, American aircraft and naval vessels continue to patrol the region, citing their right to operate in international waters and airspace. But these missions often result in close calls. In one incident, a Chinese jet flew dangerously close to a U.S. reconnaissance plane. The American crew reminded the Chinese of aviation safety protocols, but tensions only escalated. Meanwhile, smaller nations like the Philippines and Vietnam continue to clash with Chinese fishing boats and Coast Guard vessels in disputed zones. Many accuse China of illegally entering their EEZs, depleting local fish stocks, and ignoring international rulings. In essence, the South China Sea has become a geopolitical powder keg, one where history, nationalism, and global trade converge. And with billions in resources at stake, not to mention strategic control of vital shipping lanes, the contest for dominance is unlikely to fade anytime soon.